So Water 101, the environment and footprinting was a real success. Everybody learned a lot. Leslie did a great job. And now we're moving to Water 201, social impacts and human rights. And just before introducing our speaker, who is also from a member institution of ICCR, the Millennium Development Goal Task Force in a report last year said, expanding access to water and sanitation is a moral and ethical imperative rooted in the cultural and religious traditions of societies around the world and enshrined in international human rights instruments. So today we are very fortunate. Patricia Jones, who is going to lead us through 201, has been an instrumental resource to ICCR. She's from the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee and has extensive background on working on water from a legal perspective, from a human rights perspective, and she has really contributed a great deal to our understanding of how this plays out in various parts of the world, including the U.S., and where are we in terms of international human rights law in relation to water. So as we're looking at the charts that Leslie put up, we also have sort of another overlay, which is the human right to water. And Patricia, welcome to ICCR, your home. And we look forward to your presentation. Afterwards, we'll have a little Q&A. There won't be an exam, but there will be a role play. So each of the tables will be getting those instructions from me afterwards. So you'll be very involved, and hopefully you're all have an actor streak in you, because we need that. Okay, Patricia.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here. ICCR is, at least within UUSC, the gold standard of organizations working in a committed and dedicated way on bettering our world. I'm so thrilled to be here. It's an honor. David and Leslie have made a place for us to be at the table, and we're very grateful. I want to point out one of my colleagues in the room, who's actually our representative, Myrna Greenfield. You can't see her, of course, because the lights are off.
You can stand up.
But Myrna is our UUSC representative here to ICCR and an expert in fair trade and issues related to corporate responsibility. So we're so happy that she's with us at UUSC. So what we're going to do, we're going to talk about the human right to water. So we're going to learn a little bit about that. We're going to have a Q&A after that. Hopefully this will only take about 15 minutes, my presentation that is. And so we're going to go quick. But I did want to say that Nadira, we're going to have the PowerPoint available if you would like it. We have some information over here on the table. Let me just get that infomercial out of the way so I don't have to think about it anymore. We have a little bit of a bibliography that we've put together. There's a few copies on the table. Nadira has the electronic copy. We have a fact sheet for our organization that we use. It's just basic, what's the human right to water. So there's some other materials over here to use with your congregations. We did a water justice taze that's we've used with our congregations that's very effective about raising consciousness about water issues. And a water justice praxis. How do you find out what the water justice situation is in your community? So there's a few examples over here. They're available on our website. And a real infomercial. These desktop bulletin boards. You can't see that now either, but it does say water is a human right. You can buy those from us if you'd like, and it supports our human right to water work. Okay, so commercials out of the way. Water apartheid. apartheid. We like to use this term. It's in the UN Development Report 2006, the water crisis. A lot of the UN agencies were, and still are, doing incredible work advocating for the full implementation of the human right to water as a way of addressing the water crisis. You know these statistics, but I think the water apartheid, that concept, is a very interesting one. What they basically, in this report, the research indicates that we have enough water in the world to meet human needs. There are enough economic and financial resources within governments to make access to safe, affordable, sufficient water available to everyone. Water is not prioritized. You go to almost any city in the world, whether in the global south or the north, and you will find people who don't have access to water and people who do. So we have a water apartheid that we're trying to address. Water is an issue for women and girls. On average, UUSC has a class, race, and gender screen that we prioritize our work on. That people aspect that we talked about this morning, we try and narrow it down: class, race, gender, ethnic and religious minorities, most vulnerable communities. This is really an issue affecting women and girls. Key challenges of the water sector. Nadira, could you flip on the note side? This PowerPoint is available from ICCR, and I just wanted to point out, oops, okay, I did that wrong.
There?
The red dot is in this PowerPoint, there are lots of information. So the links aren't live, unfortunately. I couldn't figure out how to get PowerPoint to let me make those links live, but you have to cut and paste them into your browser. But there's some good information there if you'd like more access to it. So back to the slide. It's financial sector. It's a financial challenge. We're not prioritizing the resources that we do have to provide water for every person to meet the human right to water. There are some very interesting models coming forward in the United States and around the world. I just want to point this out for just a minute. The new water paradigm, Clean Water Action, and some of the NGOs, environmental and social justice NGOs, working on the water sector now for 30 years in the U.S. Some very, very interesting models coming forward about how do we deal with the environmental conflicting interests, with the human conflicting interests around our water resources. So, financial challenge. Water Advocates is a policy organization founded in DC to address U.S. foreign policy aid assistance and try and prioritize water for the poor. Has some great information on their website. But spending water is a good deal. Spending money on water is a good deal. So let's talk about what is the human right to water. Is there somebody standing by the lights, or do you control those? Indira, you have control over almost everything here.
Yes, she does.
All right.
So we're going to have lights on for just a minute, but everybody who's able, put up your hand. This is what the human right to water is. Are we ready? The human right to water is access to safe, sufficient, you can say this with me, sufficient, affordable water for daily human needs for every person. So we're going to do that a couple times. My sister's a teacher. She tells me that if you repeat it 3 times, it is more likely to stick in your brain. So again, the human right to water is
Access to safe, sufficient, affordable
water for daily human needs for every person. What is that? The human right to water. Okay, one more time. Ready? Say it from the beginning. The
human right to water is access to safe, sufficient, affordable water for daily human needs.
Great. You guys are great. Okay. I don't think we need the lights again, I hope. So each of those elements has substantive content. What is access? We can think about this in the American context. It's almost actually around the world, it's almost universal. Think about water shut-off policies for non-payment. and access. Of course, Americans are not protected by the human right to water because we have not signed and ratified the international instruments that enshrine it at this point. So why UUSC is working on the ground in the United States to enshrine local human right to water policies at a utility level, at a city level, at a county level, at a state level. What's safe water? That's kind of an easy one. But what's sufficient? World Health Organization has guidelines on what sufficiency is. Water Advocates is working towards implementing international aid financing, at least from the US perspective, to try and meet 20 liters per person per day, which the World Health Organization sets as the minimum necessary for life. 20 liters per person per day. Affordable. Human right to water says water doesn't have to be free necessarily. Human rights doesn't demand that free water be provided. However, inability to pay cannot be a barrier to access water. So, lifeline rates. We want to drive conservation of water with our water rate structures in our cities. It's great. We want to make overuse of water very expensive. We have to be really careful to look at the bottom of that rate structure and ensure that there's a lifeline rate so that every large family, every senior, every disabled person, every unemployed person has access to a minimum amount, the human right to water. Human rights obligations fall primarily on governments, but they also fall on the private sector. Governments must respect, protect, and fulfill. Private sector must protect. So we wrote a chapter in Leslie's great report, which is over here on the table, Liquid Assets. There is existing risk, in our opinion, if companies are not tracking whether or not their operations are impeding the government's ability to ensure that every person in that country, which has enshrined the Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example, which almost all but 2 or 3 countries, including us, have adopted, which has direct provisions for the right to water. If they are not tracking that risk, they are not managing their risk. It's an obligation of conduct on the government, not result. What does that mean? It means that the government must make its best efforts to provide water within existing resources. Does it mean that if there's one person in that city or that town without water, that the government is violating its international obligations? It's different if they have enshrined a constitutional provision at the national level in a country, which 12, 13 countries have done. So we have existing law. It's not a question of, is this country recognize the human right to water? The human right to water exists. It's existing international legal obligations. National governments have, countries have adopted constitutional provisions for the right to water. National courts have found the right to water within constitutional provisions, whether in some cases, Argentina and India, where there are not direct provisions for a human right to water in the Constitution. So we have existing law. General comment 15 is the legal opinion, which discusses what is the legal basis for the human right to water, what is the substantive content. Came out in 2002, very controversial. 2005 UN guidelines. I want to highlight this for you. It's not long. Most human rights documents from the UN are written in very plain language. They're easy to read. It's not a lot of legalese. So I really recommend that you read the source documents and become very familiar with them. They talk about sufficiency, affordability, access, these kinds of things. So where are we at? What's the status? In March 2008, the UN Human Rights Council, to address the controversy surrounding General Comment 15, and by controversy there were 6 or 7 major countries who came out against the human right to water. You could probably name some of them. One of them you could name. What's one of the countries that came out against the human right to water? The US. And surprisingly, Canada. Surprisingly, Canada. Some of the others you can name. I'm not sure about Australia, but I was thinking about Israel, China, Mexico, all the countries in the North American Free Trade Agreement against the human right to water. Some surprises. So anyway, very controversial. The UN Human Rights Council said, okay, we have the human right to water, it exists. What we need to do is to more clearly understand what its scope and content is. And this is a normal legal process. We passed our Constitution, we're still defining in the United States what the scope and content of constitutional law is. It's a very normal process, so we're defining the scope and content of the human right to water. The Human Rights Council appointed an independent expert who will be here on Friday with us. It's a great honor to have her with us. To talk about her 3-year mandate. She has just finished a year-long study on the human right to sanitation. She is now taking up, ding, ding, ding. This part of her mandate is to deal with private sector obligations for this next year. So,
Give her a pop.
and I wanted to point this out. Before the UN Human Rights Council, they also started the same meeting where they appointed the independent expert. They passed a resolution asking the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to study the nexus between climate change and human rights. There is a first report that came out in January. We are citizens of the planet. I know U.S. Americans, we've been sort of schooled a little bit in this isolationism, not necessarily this crowd, but we are also citizens of the planet, and I really recommend to you to go on to the website of the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Look at it, look at there's really easy to navigate, drop-down issues, it'll say climate change, it'll say water. Click on those and read these reports, please. Become very familiar, as a citizen of the world, we have an obligation, we have rights, we have human rights, but we also have responsibilities, and I think one of those responsibilities is to uplift human rights in everything that we do. Because we have them as citizens, not as American citizens, but as citizens of the world. And we need to, so that's the pitch for being more conversant with your human rights. Climate change, the big interrelated human rights are health, housing, water, and food. Rights and responsibilities, protecting the water resources. David and Leslie asked about a couple of case studies. This is the Coalition Against Water Privatization in South Africa. It is a very, very, very grassroots NGO. South African Constitution enshrined the first constitutional human right to water in the new Constitution. Johannesburg Water, which is a quango, it's a public, quasi-public utility. In order to get, because all international financing for utilities, whether they're public or private, are generally from development banks or from foreign aid direct from governments, are conditioned on privatization, or have been the last 15 years, had to do a management contract with Suez to get French aid financing for extending services in their service area. Suez, okay, 5 minutes. Instituted a whole series of policies, prepay water meters. They dropped the free basic water that South Africans had under apartheid by half. They increased the rates. CAWP challenged under the South African Constitution, won at the first court. So you can imagine what this would have at the international level. Here we're defining the scope and content of the human right to water. The first national constitution that enshrines the human right to water. Johannesburg Water, the richest town in South Africa, violating their own constitution. So this is talking about strategic case studies, strategic issues for helping to put pressure and also shore up the human right to water, which is one thing I hope ICCR can take up. Just went to Johannesburg Water appealed, won at the appellate court on some of the issues we appealed. It was just before the Supreme Court on the 3rd of September, so watch for information about this. Ecuador, this was Bechtel, not publicly traded, Guayaquil, but they've since sold their interests to Veolia. So now Veolia holds all of Interagua's interests in Guayaquil. A whole series of mismanagement, hepatitis A case, 13,000 1,300 children contracted a very serious strain of Hep A, out of school from 6 months to a year, parents having to absorb all the costs of the health care of their children. 2 deaths, 2 boys died as a result of, once the Hep A was discovered, they shut off the water to this entire neighborhood. These 2 boys went to wash their school uniforms, because you got to be clean to go to school, of course, and fell in the drainage ditch and drowned. Mikameta, Movimiento Mikameta, another grassroots organization, took Bechtel and Nicaragua to court, won some serious fines, $5.6 million, required Bechtel to, or Nicaragua to pay back 40,000 households and to turn back on the water to the 40,000 households that they had shut off. All of this led to a new constitution, has the human right to water in it, so some very interesting things happening in Ecuador. The U.S. This is a really important case, and just really precedent-setting. A whole network of grassroots NGOs, environmental, human rights, social justice, working on water issues for 20 years in California, decided to see if we couldn't prioritize in California water for the poor. There's 11.5 million Californians who are drinking water that violates federal and state Drinking Water Quality Act. There are somewhere between 150 to 200,000 Californians who don't have access to potable water. One of the richest economies in the world, of course, it's broke. The state's broke, but very important success. Passed the Assembly in June, just passed the Senate about 6-7 days ago. The governor signaled he's going to veto the bill. The first human right to water bill, and basically make California prioritize water to the poor, with all that economic stimulus money coming into their coffers, and address the problems of vulnerable communities first. Very important in the U.S. This is an example in Boston, another grassroots organization. This is the water shutoff pattern from 2002 to 2006. These are households. Again, one of the more wealthier cities in the country. Nearly 2,000 households in Boston shut off of water. They just finished a very important research, MIT peer-reviewed, on the confluence of race and water shutoffs. For every 1% increase in a ward, that's the jurisdiction in Boston, of people of color, there was a 4% increase in water shutoffs in Boston. Well, this is New York. So New York's got a water shutoff policy. By the way, New York Water Authority doesn't have very good information on their website.
I believe they do.
Well, I couldn't find the water shutoff policy. And I mean, they've got an ombudsman, they've got some due process that's okay, but we still have a water shutoff policy. And in fact, in New York, and this started in 2008, if you haven't paid your water bill, and this was for households, I think there was something like 8,200 households at the time that this was enacted, you can lose your house if you can't pay your water bill. This isn't unusual in the United States. Some of the other knock-on effects are, and these are some of the doors we have to close. If you can't pay your water bill and you don't have water to your home, Child Protective Services, almost universally across the country, are required to come in and remove the children from the custodial care of the parent and place them in foster care, whose water bills are subsidized. This happens. These are some of the issues that we have to deal with. So the role for the faith community. You guys are already doing this. North Star Asset Management is a SRI investment firm. Took up the human right to water, and we helped them out a little bit with technical assistance. Made world precedent-setting policy. PepsiCo, as a private corporation, as far as I know, David would be able to tell us this, but I think it's the first private corporation that has actually stated publicly in this human right to water policy that as a private actor, we have human rights obligations. I mean, it's setting the human rights world on its ear.
Actually, Suez is also recognized for what
Did they?
human right to water.
Yay.
For what it's worth.
Another one that's you might not know about, Connecticut Water, private water provider, adopted a human right. Also, North Star and UUSC worked on this one, adopted a human right to water. We're in this process now, beginning the dialogue with PepsiCo about implementation. What is this really going to mean for Connecticut Water? They've taken a step ahead and implemented at least one part of this, the affordability part of the human right to water. They have set aside 1% of all of their revenues and established a fund. So if there are people in their service area who are at risk of having their water shut off, they can access this fund. It still sounds in charity, but at least it's a first step toward implementing affordability. And that's a private provider. So thank you.
So, any questions for Patricia?
Only if you're prizes.
You've won at least twice, so that's it. Any questions? Comments? Yes.
Thank you, Patricia. It was very interesting. My question is, I didn't understand exactly what is ICCR now doing in these cases. For instance, with Veolia, because ourselves, we remarked that in Italy we had a problem with a subsidiary held by Veolia, so we started a kind of engagement. At the time being, we don't have shares of Veolia anymore in our portfolio, but that would be interesting for us to understand what you do, or what we were doing together.
Yeah, Veolia just bought Interagua's. UUSC has limited capacity, so Veolia just bought Interagua's shares in December, which is interesting because it was after the Constitution passed, and in the Constitution, the new Constitution says you can't privatize water resources. So I think they got in the game to be able to get the payout to get out. I'm not really sure. So that has some ethical questions. But UUSC doesn't have shares yet in Veolia, so we're considering it, but we haven't decided yet what we're going to do. ICCR.
Much of the human rights work around corporate accountability has been to adopt and develop and implement corporate policies related to comprehensive human rights, which includes water, but it includes a whole range of international human rights, including labor rights. So it's only been recently that we've been focusing on the human right to water specifically, because of Pepsi, I think that gives us an opening to raise that issue with other companies as well. Especially where we've had success in getting companies to adopt human rights, larger human rights policies. This can be worked in, and some of the implementation may be easier since they've done that. Now, there are about 250 companies globally that have adopted human rights policies. Some of the work that we've done has really helped that. There are other organizations that have worked in Europe, et cetera. So this is an area where we're going to really be going much more deeply, and we'll share responses as we get in more to the human right to water. Thanks. Any other questions? Another question or comment? Okay.